The courtroom buzzed with subdued murmurs as people filed into the rows of wooden benches. A faint hum of anticipation hung in the air, weaving through the whispers of onlookers who had come to witness the latest headline-grabbing trial. Seated at the defendant's table was Sammy Taylor, a boy who seemed barely older than 12. His small frame, draped in an oversized hoodie, looked lost against the imposing backdrop of the courtroom. Sammy's wide, dark eyes darted nervously around the room, lingering on the imposing figure presiding over the court, Judge Evelyn Graves. Judge Graves was a woman of authority. Her name, synonymous with justice, served swiftly and without compromise. She had built her career on decisiveness and a no-nonsense approach to the law, earning her both respect and fear. Today, she was tasked with overseeing the case of young Sammy Taylor, a boy accused of trespassing in an affluent neighborhood, a crime that had sparked outrage among the local community. As the gavel struck the wooden block, silence swept through the room. Judge Graves, clad in her black judicial robe, glanced down at the case file before her. Her eyes flicked to Sammy, who was visibly trembling. "Defendant Samuel Taylor," she began, her voice crisp and steady, "you stand accused of trespassing on private property. How do you plead?" Sammy's lawyer, a harried public defender, leaned in to whisper urgently in his ear. Sammy's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. His gaze shifted downward as he mumbled, "Not guilty." "Speak up, young man," Judge Graves said firmly. Sammy swallowed hard and repeated, louder this time, "Not guilty." The judge nodded briskly, jotting something in her notes before motioning for the prosecution to proceed. As the prosecutor began outlining the case, detailing how Sammy had been found wandering through a gated community after dark, Sammy's eyes wandered. He scanned the faces in the courtroom until his gaze landed on Judge Graves again. This time, he froze. His small chest heaved as he struggled to steady his breathing. There was something in her face, in the sharp line of her jaw and the piercing focus of her eyes, that made his heart race. Recognition flickered across his features, a realization so intense it seemed to electrify the air around him. As the prosecutor continued to speak, Sammy abruptly stood up. His chair screeched against the tiled floor, the sudden noise cutting through the prosecutor's monologue. All eyes turned to the boy, whose face was flushed with emotion. "You're my mother," Sammy blurted out, his voice trembling but unmistakably clear. The room erupted in gasps. The prosecutor's words died on his lips as he stared at the boy in shock. Even the court reporter paused, her fingers hovering above the stenotype machine. Judge Graves' pen stopped mid-motion. For a long moment, she stared at Sammy, her composed exterior cracking ever so slightly. Her eyes narrowed as if searching for clarity in the storm of confusion that his words had unleashed. "What did you just say?" she asked, her voice uncharacteristically soft, betraying the faintest quiver. Sammy's lips trembled as tears welled in his eyes. "You're my mother," he repeated, louder this time, the words slicing through the stunned silence like a blade. For the first time in her illustrious career, Judge Evelyn Graves faltered. Her usually steely gaze softened, her hand trembling as she lowered her pen. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder, filling the void left by the judge's unspoken response. The walls of her tightly constructed life seemed to shudder under the weight of Sammy's declaration. And for the first time in years, Evelyn Graves felt truly unmoored. The heavy oak door to Judge Evelyn Graves' chambers clicked shut behind her, silencing the hum of murmurs that had erupted in the courtroom. Inside, the stillness was almost suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock. Evelyn sank into her chair, her hands gripping the edge of her desk as though it might anchor her in a moment that was threatening to spiral out of control. Her composure, carefully cultivated over decades, now hung by a fragile thread. For years, she had buried the memory of her son deep within the recesses of her mind, locking it away like a secret she dared not revisit. But now, that secret was sitting in her courtroom, staring back at her with wide, tear-filled eyes. "You're my mother," he had said. The words echoed in her mind, relentless and accusing. She closed her eyes, and the years fell away. 18. She had been just 18, a senior in high school, living in a small, conservative town where reputations were currency. Her future had been neatly mapped out: college, a career, and perhaps marriage to a boy her parents approved of. But then came the test, the small, pink plus sign that turned her world upside down. Her parents' faces flashed in her memory. Her mother's tears, her father's tight-lipped anger. "You'll ruin your future," they had told her. "Think of what people will say." The decision had not felt like a choice. They'd arranged everything: the doctor, the adoption agency, even the paperwork. Evelyn had been too young and too scared to fight back. When the baby was born, they allowed her a single moment to hold him. She remembered the weight of him in her arms, the soft warmth of his tiny body, and the way his little fingers had curled instinctively around hers. His cries had pierced her heart, and for a fleeting second, she had considered running, taking him and leaving everything behind. But she hadn't. She'd let them take him away, her parents assuring her that he would be adopted by a loving family, that he would have opportunities she could never provide. "You're doing the right thing," they had said. For years, Evelyn convinced herself it was true. She threw herself into her studies, then into her career, working tirelessly to become someone her younger self might have admired. But late at night, when the world was quiet, she often found herself thinking about the baby she'd lost. Was he happy? Did he know he was loved? Did he ever wonder about her? And now he was here, Sammy Taylor. No longer a baby, but a boy. Her boy, standing in her courtroom, accusing her with nothing more than his presence. The conflict within her was unbearable. How could she reconcile the woman she was now with the scared girl she had been then? Could she even begin to explain to Sammy why she had made the choices she had? The knock at her door startled her. It was Gloria Burns, the court senior clerk, and one of the few people Evelyn trusted implicitly. Gloria stepped inside, her expression soft but concerned. "Evelyn," she said gently, "I know this is complicated, but that boy out there, he's looking for answers, and you're the only one who can give them." Evelyn nodded, her throat tight. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted. Gloria placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Start with the truth." The truth. Evelyn's breath hitched. She had spent so long avoiding it, building walls of achievement and authority to keep it at bay. But now, those walls were crumbling, and the truth was the only thing left to hold on to. Slowly, she stood, smoothing the front of her robe. She couldn't erase the past, but maybe, just maybe, she could begin to make amends. The courtroom murmurs faded as the judge declared a brief recess. Sammy sat alone at the defendant's table, his small hands clutching a creased photograph. The edges of the image were worn, its colors faded, but its subject was unmistakable: a baby swaddled in a yellow blanket, his tiny face scrunched in sleep. Sammy's fingers traced the outline of the blanket as he whispered to his lawyer, "She's the woman in the picture." The lawyer glanced at the photo, his brows furrowed in confusion. "Are you sure, Sammy? That was a long time ago." Sammy's gaze never wavered. "I'm sure. I've been carrying this picture my whole life." His voice trembled, but there was a resolve in his eyes that belied his young age. Meanwhile, Judge Evelyn Graves retreated to her chambers. The sound of the heavy door closing behind her felt final, like the echo of a gavel sealing her fate. Her hands trembled as she pressed them flat against her desk, trying to steady herself. The storm of emotions swirling inside her threatened to break free: guilt, fear, and a yearning she hadn't allowed herself to feel in decades. The photo. It had been years since she'd seen it, but the image was seared into her memory. She had stared at that very same photo through tears the day she had signed the adoption papers. Now, it had resurfaced in the hands of the boy who had called her mother in a courtroom full of strangers. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Gloria Burns, the court senior clerk and Evelyn's closest confidant. Gloria's years as a social worker had given her a deep well of empathy, and she carried it with her now as she stepped into the room. "Evelyn," Gloria said softly, her voice steady but tinged with concern, "you're not just dealing with a case here. That boy isn't a statistic or a file number. He's your chance to mend what was broken." Evelyn sank into her chair, shaking her head. How can I fix this, Gloria? I abandoned him. Her voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands. Gloria stepped closer, her tone firm but kind. You made a decision that you thought was right at the time. But now, you have an opportunity to give him what he's been searching for. The truth. Evelyn looked up, her eyes red but resolute. Gloria's words were a lifeline in the chaos of her guilt. She took a deep breath and nodded. Minutes later, the courtroom came alive with whispers as Judge Graves returned to the bench. Her expression was calm, but her eyes betrayed the storm within. Given the circumstances, she announced, this court will hear the defendant's plea privately. Bailiff, escort Mr. Taylor to the conference room. Sammy's heart raced as he followed the bailiff through a side door. Behind him, the courtroom buzzed with speculation, but he paid no attention. In the quiet of the conference room, he sat at a plain table, his photograph clutched tightly in his hand. Moments later, Judge Graves entered. The door clicked shut behind her, and the two of them were alone. For a moment, neither spoke, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Evelyn finally broke the silence, her voice quiet but steady. Let's talk, Sammy. The boy's eyes filled with tears as he slid the photograph across the table. Do you remember this? He asked, his voice trembling. Evelyn's hand hovered over the photo, her breath catching as she stared at the image. The past she had tried so hard to bury had come rushing back. Her voice cracked as she whispered, Yes, Sammy. I remember. The conference room felt oppressively quiet, the stark white walls amplifying the tension that hung heavy in the air. Sammy sat across from Judge Evelyn Graves, his small hands clenched into fists on the table. His eyes, wide and brimming with tears, bore into her with a mixture of pain and accusation. The photograph he had carried for so long lay between them, a fragile bridge connecting their shared past. Why didn't you want me? Sammy's voice broke the silence, trembling with the weight of years spent wondering. His words struck Evelyn like a blow, her composure unraveling as she struggled to find the right response. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she folded them on the table. It wasn't that I didn't want you, Sammy, she began, her voice faltering. I was young. I was just 18, still in high school, and I didn't know how to take care of you. My parents said adoption was the best thing, the only thing. They convinced me you'd have a better life with someone else. Sammy's brows furrowed, his lips trembling as he bit back the tears threatening to spill. A better life? He echoed, his voice rising. Do you think bouncing between foster homes is a better life? Never knowing if anyone really wants you. Evelyn's heart shattered at his words. Tears streamed down her face as she reached for the photo, her fingers brushing its frayed edges. I didn't know that would happen, she whispered. I thought you'd be adopted by a family who could give you everything I couldn't. I thought I was doing the right thing. Sammy's hands unclenched, though his expression remained guarded. You never tried to find me, he said, his voice quieter but no less pained. Not once. Evelyn's breath hitched as guilt tightened its grip on her. I was scared, she admitted, her voice cracking. I told myself that you were happy, that you didn't need me disrupting your life. But the truth is, I was afraid to face what I'd done. Afraid that you wouldn't want me in your life. For a moment, silence settled between them. Sammy's gaze softened, though the hurt in his eyes remained. Do you even care now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn's hands trembled as she reached across the table, stopping just short of touching his. More than you'll ever know, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I've thought about you every single day. I've wondered who you'd become, if you were happy, if you were safe. And now that you're here, I can't undo the past, but I want to be part of your life. If you'll let me? Sammy's lip quivered as he looked down at the photo. The weight of his anger, though not gone, felt lighter. He slid the photograph back toward her, his voice barely audible. I don't know if I can forgive you yet, he said, but maybe we can start with this. Evelyn's tears fell freely as she picked up the photo, holding it as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Thank you, she whispered. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope, fragile but real, bridging the divide between them. The days following their emotional confrontation in the conference room were tentative, fragile steps towards something neither Evelyn nor Sammy fully understood. The connection between them, tenuous as it was, felt like a thread pulling them together, one they both cautiously followed. Evelyn's first gesture was simple but heartfelt, a handwritten note delivered to Sammy's social worker. "I want to spend time with him," it read, "wherever he feels safe." Their first meeting outside the courtroom took place at a quiet park. Sammy sat on a bench, clutching a basketball. Evelyn arrived with 2 steaming cups of hot chocolate, her hands trembling as she handed one to him. For a while, they sat in silence, the sounds of children's laughter and rustling leaves filling the void between them. Slowly, Sammy began to talk. He told her about the foster homes he'd been in, the ones where he'd felt invisible and the ones where he'd felt unwanted. Evelyn listened intently, her heart breaking with each word. "I used to think you'd come find me," Sammy admitted, staring down at his shoes. "Every new house, I'd think, this is the one where she'll show up, but you never did." Evelyn's voice caught in her throat. "I'm sorry, Sammy. I was scared, and I made the wrong choice. But I'm here now. I promise I'll keep showing up." True to her word, Evelyn did. They met twice a week, sometimes at the library where Sammy liked to read graphic novels, sometimes at the youth center where he played basketball. Slowly, Evelyn began to share her own stories, not just about the mistakes she had made, but also about her dreams and fears. She told him about the pressure she'd felt as a young girl, the nights she'd cried herself to sleep after giving him up, and the shame she'd carried for years. "I've always wondered what kind of person you'd grow up to be," she confessed during one of their visits. "And now that I know you, I'm so proud of who you are." Sammy's walls didn't come down all at once. There were moments of anger, of silence, of doubt. But as Evelyn continued to show up, a small but unmistakable shift began to occur. They started attending therapy sessions together, guided by a kind but firm counselor who helped them navigate the tangled emotions of their past. For Sammy, it was a space to voice his hurt without fear of judgment. For Evelyn, it was a place to confront the guilt she'd buried for so long. One afternoon, after a particularly intense session, Sammy looked at Evelyn and said, "I think I'm ready to call you Mom." The words were soft, almost hesitant, but they carried a weight that left Evelyn speechless. Tears welled in her eyes as she reached out and took his hand. "I'd like that," she whispered. Their relationship was far from perfect, but it was real. Over the weeks, they built something new: trust. Slowly, the wounds of the past began to heal, not because they were forgotten, but because they were faced together, one step at a time. The courtroom was quieter this time, its air lacking the tension and uncertainty that had once permeated the space. Instead, there was a palpable sense of hope. Sammy Taylor stood beside Evelyn Graves, their hands loosely clasped. Evelyn's grip was firm but gentle, a silent reassurance that she wasn't going anywhere. The judge presiding over the hearing, a kind-eyed man with salt and pepper hair, looked over the paperwork in front of him. "I have reviewed the petition for legal guardianship filed by Judge Evelyn Graves," he began, his voice steady but warm. "And I must say, it's not every day we see someone with such a storied career take such a personal step. This is clearly a decision made with great care and love." Evelyn's heart pounded as the judge continued, though she kept her expression composed. She glanced down at Sammy, who was fidgeting nervously with the hem of his shirt. When he felt her gaze, he looked up and gave her a small, tentative smile. Evelyn's chest tightened. She had waited so long for this moment, and now it was finally here. "Therefore," the judge concluded, "I am pleased to grant the petition. From this day forward, Samuel Taylor will be under the legal guardianship of Evelyn Graves." He banged the gavel lightly, a symbolic gesture that seemed to echo in Evelyn's heart. The room erupted in applause. Gloria Burns, who had been sitting in the gallery, wiped away tears as she clapped enthusiastically. Even Sammy's lawyer, who had initially approached the case with guarded skepticism, wore a broad smile. Evelyn turned to Sammy and crouched down, so they were eye level. Tears streamed freely down her face, but she didn't bother to wipe them away. "This is just the beginning," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Sammy's lips curved into a smile, a real one this time, full of warmth and hope. "I believe you," he said softly. For the first time, his words carried no trace of doubt or hesitation. As they walked out of the courtroom hand in hand, the gravity of what had just happened settled over them. The pain and anger that had once defined their relationship were still there, but they no longer felt insurmountable. Together, they had turned their shared scars into a foundation, something they could build upon. Outside, the sun was shining, its rays spilling across the courthouse steps. Evelyn paused and turned to Sammy. "How about we celebrate?" "Ice cream?" she suggested, her tone light. Sammy's grin widened. "Only if I can have 2 scoops," he teased, the playful tone in his voice making Evelyn laugh. "2 scoops it is," she agreed, her heart feeling lighter than it had in years. As they walked toward her car, Gloria caught up to them. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with pride. Evelyn nodded, glancing at Sammy. "We did it," she corrected. And as they drove away, the sun warming their faces, Evelyn and Sammy both knew this wasn't just the end of a legal process. It was the start of a life where they could finally be what they had both longed for, a family.